Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you've joined us. This past year has been a tumultuous year for our nation, and I confess for me as an individual as well. I experienced a kind of awakening. It was hard awakening. The deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, amongst others, landed on me like a bolt of lightning, and it was jarring. Their deaths disorienting, horrifying. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Their deaths enraged me, broke my heart. And out of that came a desire to know more, to learn more. How did we get to this place? Why does this keep happening? Why is this the experience of so many people of color, particularly Black men and women in our country? And it launched me on a pursuit of understanding racial justice. And one of the authors that I read was Jemar Tisby, and I enjoyed his Netflix series on the color of compromise and his book. And then just this year in January, he released the Fight for Racial, How to Fight Racism. And I loved it because it was so practical and so helpful and answered some of those questions that many of us were feeling of, my heart is engaged. I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. And so his book, How to Fight Racism, I found incredibly practical and very doable. And so today I get to interview Jemar, and he is, as I said, the best-selling author of these two incredible books, Color of Compromise and How to Fight Racism. He recently joined the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University as the Assistant Director for Narrative and Advocacy. He is the founder of the Whiteness Incorporated and co-host of Pass the Mic podcast. He speaks nationally about history and religion and anti-racism. And if you're on social media or any of those places, you've seen him on or heard him on other podcasts and follow him. And we're just really honored to have him today. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jemar Tisby. Well, I am so excited to have you on this conversation today, Jemar. I've been looking forward to this. It's taken us several months to get our schedule together because you are busy.
Takes one to know one, but I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. I really am so thrilled. I thank you for your willingness to talk again. I mean, you must be every single day. You are talking, you are telling your story, you are telling about your book, telling about your books. And so we're just so glad that you are here to talk to us today. So thank you. You have written a new book, which we will talk about, which I mentioned in the introduction. But first, I want you to just tell our audience a little bit, just more on the personal. I've already given them all your wonderful, your credentials and all the things you're doing and all what you're working towards, but just a little about yourself, your family and your work.
Yeah, I think it's important for folks to know, especially for Christian audiences, that I am approaching this from an insider's perspective, somebody who is in the church and loves the church, somebody who's interacted a lot with Christians across the racial and ethnic spectrum. And so, what I have to say, especially in terms of truth telling and critique, isn't throwing stones. It's just like that wonderful passage in the epistles where you speak the truth in love. Why? So that the body can build itself up, so that we can grow, so that we can be stronger and healthier. So that's where I'm coming from. That story, begins in eternity, of course, but in my lifetime, I became a Christian in high school through the ministry of a white evangelical youth group. And so these dynamics of race and Christianity were kind of always part of my story. I went to undergrad at the University of Notre Dame, which was a Catholic school, but it was there that I began reading books by Reformed theological pastors and theologians. It was after undergrad that I joined Teach for America, and that's how I got down to the Deep South. I had grown up in the Midwest, north of Chicago. And the county I live in currently, as we record, has been listed as the fourth poorest county in the entire nation. And so you can think of all these effects of acute concentrated poverty, from food deserts to a lack of healthcare, closing of rural hospitals, underfunding in education, the lack of jobs, all of that took on a human face because it walked into my classroom every day. And through my students and their families, I was exposed to historic injustices and their present effects. And I began asking questions of my faith. What does Christianity have to say about these issues of justice, which were so closely tied to race? I mean, being in the South, in the Delta, it's literally cotton country. And so you can think of sharecropping, race-based chattel slavery, and all of that. That led me eventually to seminary at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, where I began doing some of this work more publicly about racial reconciliation then, what I refer to as racial justice now. And that eventually led to me getting this PhD in history at the University of Mississippi. And then now my latest venture is at the Center for Anti-Racist Research, affiliated with Boston University.
Like I said, busy man. Busy man. But what a story. You've just really been all over the place. You've seen such different slices of the Black experience and just life in America. And that has prepared you in some unique ways for, it feels like, what God has you doing right now. And you mentioned the church, you mentioned, relationship with Jesus, and that you're coming to this whole conversation as a man of faith. So tell us, if you would, just, I mean, you could write an entire book on what it's like to be a Black man in America, what it's like to be a Black Christian in America. And we don't, so obviously I can't hear all of that, but just give us kind of a snippet of what, if you had to encapsulate what it's been like to be a Black Christian in the Reformed evangelical space in the United States. What has that looked like for you? And maybe where it's brought you to where we are today, which then that'll take us to your book. But just tell us kind of an overview of what are the high points, the high and the low points of what that's looked like.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just interrupt before you say that? Because I
Yes.
also listened to the podcast that you're a part of, the Whiteness.
Yes.
And I heard you do one recently on leaving loud or leaving
Right.
loudly. So you got to tell us just a little bit about that too.
So yes, Leave Loud is a campaign that we started through the Witness, and it's about telling our stories. It's about witnessing to our experience in terms of race within Christianity. I mean, the sad fact is the most acute and sustained racism I've ever experienced has always come from other Christians. That's a tragic but true instance. And so there was an article that a New York Times reporter, Campbell Robertson, did a few years ago during the Trump presidency, where the story was called The Quiet Exodus. And it was about Black churchgoers quietly leaving their predominantly white church spaces over sort of the treatment they received, the stances that the churches were taking. And so sort of riffing off of that, we're talking about leaving loud. So instead of just sort of quietly slipping out the side door or the back door, we're saying, listen, we have spoken about this. We've had the conferences, the panels, the books, the one-on-one conversations, and you still aren't changing. And in the meantime, you're spiritually traumatizing people, their sense of betrayal and hurt. And so we're going to tell that story, not in any sense of trashing the church or anything like that, but in the hopes that you get better. When in Mark chapter 6, when Jesus sends out the disciples, he says, if they won't receive you, shake the dust off your sandals. But there's another part to that, as a testimony against them. And so it's not just the leaving, it's the judgment that, due to hard-heartedness, due to the unwillingness to change on these matters of race, it's actually a testimony against these fellowships, these churches, these denominations. And that's why we're leaving loud. And so you ask what it's like. It's a state of constant vigilance that's exhausting. Just being, a person of color, particularly a Black person in America. The analogy I use in the book, How to Fight Racism, is it's the difference between a light switch and a smoke detector. So a light switch you can flick on and off. A lot of white people race is like a light switch that they'll flick it on when there's a uprising or a headline or some incident, but they'll flick it off as soon as, the headline changes or it gets difficult to actually journey down the road of racial justice. Black people and people of color, we don't have that choice. We have to be constantly vigilant, just like a smoke detector is only effective if it's constantly on, because the danger might occur at any moment. And so you can just sort of imagine how exhausting this state of hypervigilance is, that at any moment we might go through some sort of racially traumatic event. So it's tiring in that sense. But I will say this to sort of round out my response. Being Black isn't the problem. Being a person of color isn't the problem. Racism is the problem.
Yep.
And I say that to highlight the beauty and the joy that I know of being Black. Like, I'm glad I'm in this skin I'm in. I'm glad I've had the connections and the relationships and the culture that I've been exposed to from being a person of African descent. And I don't want us to confuse the sin of racism with the glorious image bearing of being a person of color.
So much. I want to do this. I want to talk that. I want to say that. So try to organize my thoughts here, even in response to that. I'm just in this. Yeah, there's so much. Do you have 3 hours, please? Because I can't possibly, I can't contain everything I want.
Of this.
I can't possibly contain everything I want to say or ask you about or comment on. So I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but I know in your book you said that 2020 has felt different in regard to the response to racial injustice that's existed, but there's something different about it that has made, I think everybody feels it. What happened in 2020 around these issues has been both explosive. It's been both negative and positive. I feel like negatively, there have been deaths, there have been people hurt, there have been people wounded, even physically and emotionally more so. At the same time, it's opened up a conversation that is so far overdue, and we are so far behind in honestly, realistically, genuinely, compassionately, is there such a word as repentively? I just made one up, but that kind of a stance and approach and a posture that I'm glad, honestly, that we're at this place, but it's not without a cost.
That's right.
And you just said in the tiniest amount of words, some of the cost to you personally, but also the cost to other people of color. So I do want to know what you think made this year different. How many Black men have been killed, have been murdered? How many people of color have suffered injustice, unspeakable injustice? Why now? Mm-hmm. What makes this different? And then I want to come back to just even how I have seen people then respond in the circles that I'm in and in our church in particular. But if you wouldn't mind, just Why is this different? Why is it different now?
Thank you for that question. I've been saying over and over again, and it could come back to bite me, but this feels like the civil rights movement of our day. I'm a historian by training, and I look specifically at racial social movements in the 20th century, such as the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and associated movements. And I see a lot of echoes of the past, multiple organizations engaging in this work, a sort of public attention being sustained on these topics of racial justice, legislation being considered and passed, all of those things. But even more so, if you look at the 2020 uprisings, in terms of numbers, they eclipsed by far the numbers of people involved in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And not only that, who comprised these protests? It's white people. White people participated in greater numbers than ever before in US history. So those marks, as well as some of the changes that we saw. I mean, I always point to the fact that finally, after literally 126 years, the state flag of Mississippi with the Confederate emblem in its canton finally came down in 2020, right? Like that's incomprehensible. If you only knew, because I have to pass that flag twice on my way, each time going to the University of Mississippi, and it literally casts a shadow over the entire state, which, by the way, has the highest proportion of Black people of any state in the Union. And those two things, the Confederate emblem on the flag and the proportion of Black people, it's not a coincidence, right? So we see some of these changes. And why now? Well, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it is cumulative in its effects. So I think, you know, some people have called this the Trayvon Martin generation.
Hmm.
In terms of all the way back in 2012, and we didn't have video footage or anything, but just hearing about, you know, Trayvon Martin getting killed by this sort of neighborhood vigilante, the acquittal the next year, which birthed the phrase Black Lives Matter. Then in 2014, Mike Brown getting killed made Black Lives Matter the sort of banner, and I think that's a big part of why now it's sort of a rallying phrase and statement for this current movement. And then you had a cascade of events, not least of which was not just the past presidency, but the one before it. So the back-to-back of Barack Obama as the first Black president and then Donald Trump as the next president, that formed a not just a political, but a cultural mix that made right now really ripe for conversations about race.
You know, I had written down just some notes because one of the things that you suggest people do, one of the things you suggest in How to Fight Racism is that you suggest that people learn and study and explore their own racial identity. And never thought of that before, never occurred to me. And I thought it would be simple. It's been fascinating and heartbreaking. And I've had kind of like mind-blowing moments it's been amazing, and I can't recommend that highly enough. And you might want to talk about that in a minute. Like I said, I just need 3 hours. But in that, you started this particular section by talking about how this reminded you of the civil rights movement. I was alive. I was a child. I was a little girl. I was, you know, when President Kennedy was assassinated, I was in 3rd grade. And the next year, Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I was alive when Martin Luther King was shot. I saw the marches on TV. Before that, I saw people being hosed with, law enforcement hosing down, peaceful protesters. I saw the dogs unleashed on people. I was alive when Martin Luther King was making his speeches and when he was assassinated, and RFK. That was my coming of age years up till I was about 15. And I have said many times in this past year to my children and anybody who would listen, basically, of that reminds me, this time reminds me the most of the tumult of that period of time. There was the Vietnam War, there was civil unrest, there was protests in the streets, there were horrible things that were happening, there were bombs, assassinations of public people. It was a tumultuous time. Yeah. And this has felt the closest like it. And to think then that this would be the avenue in which great change can actually happen, it makes sense to me. I've lived in both periods, and I can see how the unrest and the change in that period of time, in that decade, is affecting us today. And it's scary. It's I think we're all a little on edge between the pandemic and the trauma of the political season that we've just gone through, and then the racial injustice. It's tumultuous and we are feeling it. I've talked to several of my friends of color who, they knew I was going to be talking to you, and I said, so if you had the opportunity to sit in a room with Jemar Tisby, what would you ask him? And all three of them, the three have said the exact same thing. I'm tired. I am so weary. I heard you say it. I'm weary. One of my friends said, I'm done. I can't put myself out there again to keep trusting myself in particularly white majority churches
That's right.
where I thought we were friends. I thought we were friends until the political scene changed, and suddenly people that I thought were my friends, I felt like they probably secretly hated me or disdained me at the very least. I can't be in that. Two other friends said, I'm so tired of explaining myself. I'm so tired of telling my story. So tired of everybody now upset and saying, so tell me, educate me, explain this to me. And all three have just said, I'm so tired. Please ask him. How do
Mm,
we take care of ourselves when we are weary in this time? Weary, weary, weary. And how do we balance that in, well, you talked about the leave loud.
yeah.
Some people of color, some Black people are saying, I can't stay in the white majority church anymore. I because it's too hard. It's
Right.
killing me and I
Yeah.
can't keep doing it. And so for those who choose to stay,
Mhm.
what do you, I hear the weary, I hear the fatigue that's just at the bone deep level.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I mean, just as a concrete example, um, as we record this, the verdict from the Derek Chauvin trial is relatively recent. That came out on a Tuesday. We found
A
out
week
that same
ago,
week.
just
Yeah,
just a week ago.
just a week. It feels like so much longer. And within that same week, what did we hear about? We heard about Dante Wright, another Black man who was killed. We heard about Adam Toledo, who's a 13-year-old Latino boy in Chicago who got killed. We heard about Ma'Khia Bryant, a 16-year-old who got killed. And so there was hardly a moment to process this huge verdict before we hear about all these police-related killings. So there's the sort of broader cultural national picture, but then that's compounded by being in spaces, especially Christian spaces that are majority white, where you are constantly having to explain and defend and justify your lived experience, as well as a historical experience that goes far beyond an individual, to people who oftentimes don't seem ready or willing to understand. And so from a practical standpoint, what do you do about that exhaustion? One, I think theologically and biblically, there's some precedents and some understandings we can have. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." And I interpret that exhaustion that we have as this hunger and thirsting for righteousness, right? Like we want racial righteousness, we want racial justice, and the fatigue that we feel is that spiritual hunger and thirst for righteousness, which is yet to come. So we're in good company. Jesus sees us. Practically speaking, there are a few things. One, we live in an information age, and there is such a thing as too much information. So we're really not designed to mentally or spiritually just take on all of these burdens, because we can hear about injustices not only in our own local community, but statewide, nationally, and even internationally. So if all we're doing is scrolling, they call it doom scrolling on social media, guess what? You're going to be inundated by bad news. And so we have to actually have really good boundaries,
Yeah.
know when to turn off the information flow, just so we can process, not hide our heads in the sand,
Right.
but just be able to process.
To rest.
Yes, to rest, a Sabbath, a social media Sabbath, an information Sabbath. We also need community. And I think what this pandemic has taught us is that the church is more than just a building. It's not just a place, it's a people. So when we literally couldn't physically gather together, we found different ways to be the church. And I think those lessons persist, especially for Black people and people of color, as and there are white folks who are in a similar but different situation, who feel increasingly alienated by their church's stances on racial topics, right? We need to find communities or create them, and it may not be in the local congregation. It's still with other Christians, but for me, the lifeline has been the group chat.
Huh.
and folks literally across the country with whom I share life literally on a daily basis.
Yeah.
It could be occasional Zoom meetings that you set up with friends from different circles or different seasons in your life, college, or when you were at a different church, or when you were at a different job, whatever it might be. So we need to get creative about community, because we cannot do this together. And then lastly, I would say truth telling is actually liberating. It feels like taking a load off of your shoulders to tell your story. A lot of us have held in the pain, we've held in the trauma. And even if telling your story is writing it in a private journal, doesn't always have to be public, but it can be. Just to articulate it, to choose the words, to name what you've been through, can be freeing.
That's powerful. And I do want to talk about you. The subtitle of your book is Courageous Christianity and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. And I believe, and I know you share this, we share a belief that this is the church's fight. This is the church's fight. The church has a terrible history around racial justice. I can only speak for the United States. I can't speak for the whole world, but I can speak for here. And the church has a largely terrible history as it relates to racial justice. And yet, when you read the Word of God, it's been used to support slavery. It's been used to fight against slavery and enslaved chattel slavery in the Civil War period. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, the church is made up of a God who claims to be the just one. He is a God of justice and righteousness. So if we're going to reflect him, then we have to be about the same things that he's about. Jesus made his declaration of what he came to do. It was to, free the captive and to take care of the blind and the needy and release the prisoner and the captive. And if we're going to be like Jesus, we have to do the same thing. So, I'm completely, absolutely, utterly convinced that it is the church that is the only entity that has what it takes to break down the evil of racism. So I know we share that belief, but why do you believe that, Jemar? Why is that? Why is your book subtitled, why is it aimed at Christians in particular joining this battle, being on this journey, joining this fight?
Well, it is a practical book, How to Fight Racism. It's literally a how-to book. And so from that standpoint, I think it's a helpful book for absolutely anybody who's interested in racial justice. You certainly don't have to be Christian to read it. I'll also say that, as you alluded to, the church, particularly predominantly white or historically white church traditions, have a very bad track record on race in this nation. And so the reality is there are a lot of non-Christian and secular individuals and organizations that have way outpaced the church and that we can learn from strategically. That being said, I did want to make clear to readers, I'm coming from, the standpoint of faith, and I do believe that Christianity has within it any of the resources we need to fight racism. For instance, I give an extended treatment of what it means to be made in the image of God and how that pertains to race and ethnicity and people groups. I give what I call in the book a brief biblical theology of race, and I show from Genesis to Revelation how diversity in the church is God's plan A and not God's plan B or C or anything else. And so this is, like you said, very much the church's work. And I believe that when we talk about these themes of love and justice and being made in the image of God and having inherent dignity and worth, that gives us a solid foundation from which we can pursue racial justice.
Yeah. So one of the things that I loved about your book and why it was so helpful to me in particular is because of just the shifts and the changes in my own heart and my all the things that this last year have exposed to me about myself, about our church in particular, because that's the place there I live my life. And so some of the changes that we've been trying to make, at Saddleback, we've always prided ourselves on being what we call an all-nation congregation, which means that we believe that our church should look the way heaven is going to look, which is every language, every tribe, every ethnicity is all going to be in heaven. Therefore, the church on earth should look like that as much as possible as well. So we've said that we're an all nation congregation, have like 167 languages represented in our church. And but just all the events of the last year have forced us to look at things differently, to see where that is a very shallow, where that's been a shallow designation for us, because we might, maybe once a year have, I don't know, All Nations Sunday, and you have people walking in carrying the flags of different nations, and we realized that, in all honesty, we were like kind of patting ourselves on the back, thinking, we're an all nation congregation, and we have 167 languages represented here in our church, and we are a multi-ethnic church, but it still was surface. It was still surface. We were not fully incorporating every ethnicity. We were not fully celebrating, and it didn't infiltrate down to leadership, down to decision making, down to our style of music. It was still very white, majority centered, and so as we began trying to really change that, what does it mean to be a multi-ethnic? What does it mean to fully celebrate and incorporate all the different ethnicities? One of the things that was just so helpful for me was to see how practical your book was, because I was left asking the question, yes, but how? Yes, but how? We want to do this. This is our heart, but how do we do it? So your book was so practical, and you have what you call the arc of racial justice, and your book is built around those are your three big bucket areas. So talk to us, if you would, about the arc of racial justice, and how does it become doable then in somebody's life and in their church?
Thank you. Yes, that's a great setup. So I'll as briefly as I can, but I just want to give some context for it. Whenever I give talks or addresses about racial justice, back before the pandemic, you would travel around and do these things, and then afterwards you'd get questions, and the most frequent question I was getting was, "What do we do?" That how-to question, that practical question, right? And so I used to give this sort of random smattering of suggestions and responses, really whatever was on my mind at that moment. But it didn't stick, and it didn't seem satisfying. So several years ago, I started developing what became the arc of racial justice, which is a model and a framework that helps us to categorize and think about a series of anti-racist actions. So instead of just listing a bunch of things you can do, we can think of them in terms of these broad categories. So the arc of racial justice is an acronym that stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. You can sort of think of it as a head, heart, hands model. Awareness is all the knowledge, data, information that we need to understand racial dynamics. So that's listening to this conversation, reading the books, watching the documentaries, etc. We can't just have big heads about it. We have to have tender hearts, and that comes through relationships. As people of faith, we believe that reconciliation is incarnational, that when God wanted to reconcile a people to God, God didn't send a tweet or a TikTok video. God sent the Son, Jesus Christ, in the flesh, to build relationships and embody that reconciliation. And in the same way, if we want to bridge these racial gaps and come to justice and solidarity, it's going to be in relationship to people, especially those who are different. And then lastly is the commitment to racial justice on a policy level. So a lot of Christians especially want to stop at that relational thing and say, well, I have friends of different races. Some of my best friends are Black. I'm not part of the problem. I'm doing my part. But all those great relationships actually don't do anything about the fact that Black women die in maternity-related deaths at 3 times the rate of white women, that almost 1 in 3 Black men will face incarceration or get caught up in the criminal justice system somehow, or the fact that our prison system, the US has 5% of the population, but 25% of the world's prison population. So we actually have to work on a systemic and institutional level to fight racial inequality. So the arc of racial justice helps us to constantly interrogate our racial justice actions.
I like that in that arc, you break it down even further into, what individuals can do, and then you move it out into like organizations or churches. So it's so practical. And that piece on awareness, that first category, that one is that was the one I think that surprised me. It didn't surprise me to think, of course, there has to be relation. There's a relational aspect of this. If it's not relational, it's transactional, and that's not the gospel. So that didn't surprise me, and it didn't really surprise me that much to think that there has to be action and actual effort toward changing, as you say, laws, healthcare. That made sense. That of course that made sense to me, even though there's more to that I'd like to come back to as well. But the awareness piece, I think, is what caught me off guard. I would have said a year ago, I was a highly sensitive person, a compassionate person, a person who cared about every person in front of me. I think in the past I would have been guilty of saying I don't see color. I would have fit into that category of somebody who would have said, I wasn't raised with, racist parents. I wasn't raised in a racist atmosphere. I am not a racist. I love everybody. I am a particularly kind. Wow, that sounded really arrogant. I'm telling you what I thought about myself and how God kind of smote me. But that's what I would have said. And last year exposed some things in me that I didn't know were there. I didn't like. I didn't realize were there. I didn't realize how blind. I didn't realize how tunnel vision. I didn't realize that I truly was looking at life. I didn't realize that I was interpreting every single thing every single day through the lens of a white woman. It just, I was blind to that. I did not, it was something I could have given intellectual assent to. Oh yes, people are different. My neighbor is different than I'm different. My husband is different than I am. And I can give an intellectual assent to that. But to truly live that out, I can say I didn't. And so that awareness piece of changing, I have a new way of seeing. It does in some ways feel like a Damascus Road experience where scales have fallen off my eyes. I have immersed myself in so many books, so many podcasts, so many individual conversations with friends, talking to people like you, following people on social media that I had never heard of a year ago, but they are filling my social media space. And they link to this and I link to that, and I'm chasing down, so really trying to increase my knowledge and my awareness. But I didn't realize that I had actually changed in a way that I could measure until just this weekend. I was watching a movie with my grandkids and my family, and the opening scene in this movie is, here's a 17-year-old white teenager. He's running, being chased by a single police officer, and they're running through the dark streets, and he is running. The cop is yelling at him, stop, stop, stop. And he keeps running, and he jumps over, it's all this big drama chasing, and the cop is chasing. And finally, I guess the kid trips, and the cop corners him up against a wall and, throws some handcuffs on him and says, you really didn't think that you could steal a cop car and get away with it, did you? And I just kind of sat back it was everything I could, and with my little grandkids, so I couldn't go, but internally I had one of those, oh my gosh, if he had been a 17-year-old of color, there is very little chance that A, there would have been just a single cop chasing him. 2, that the outcome wouldn't have been very different. And 3, a year ago, 6 months ago, I wouldn't have even skipped a beat.
Yeah.
But I couldn't look at it the same. Suddenly I had a new awareness. This is not the reality of millions of Americans. And so I not only saw it differently, but in that moment, I also was looking at it through the lens if I had been a mom or dad of color sitting there watching that movie with my family, my heart would have been in my throat, because I would have put my own child in that place, and it would have been so personal in that moment that my child might not have survived that moment if that were so. I don't know. I walked away going, awareness has changed. I have changed. And it gave me a lot of hope. It gave me a lot of hope for myself to think that that's tiny, it's such a tiny little thing, but I got it instantly. I got it instantly. And I wouldn't have gotten it a few months ago.
Well, there are a couple things there that I think are worthy of highlighting. Number one is, I think it's important, especially for white Christians, to realize that, at least in my view, it's not about fostering a sense of so-called white guilt, but a sense of godly grief. And so I write about this in the introduction to my first book, The Color of Compromise, and it's a phrase from 2 Corinthians 7. Paul is writing to the Corinthians about some sin that they were in, some behavior that he thought was unbecoming of the gospel, and he tells them about it, but he's sort of wringing his hands because he's not sure how they're going to receive it, or if they will continue to have a relationship with him. And so from a pastoral perspective, he's concerned, well, it turns out that the Corinthians do accept his word of correction. And then he writes to them in 2 Corinthians 7 and says, I'm so glad, but I'm glad not that you were grieved, but that you were grieved into repentance. And he calls that godly grief, right? So when we have these conversations, when we learn these truths, and as hard as they can be, and as much as we ourselves are implicated in the injustice, the goal isn't this, sense of white guilt, whatever definition you want to import to that. But I think it's a sense of godly grief that says, there's sorrow over injustice, there's sorrow over people being hurt, and it's a grief that leads you to want to do something different. And that's the godly grief portion of it. And then, the other part is that, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And so, of course, there's capital T truth of Jesus and the gospel, but there's lowercase t truth of that which accords to reality. And as we learn more of these truths about race and racism, then the hope and the prayer is that we would be set free to see our neighbors more lovingly, to respond more empathetically, and to react with more solidarity.
That's, I think, when you get to that heart part in the arc of racial justice, is in the relationship. And you talk about it's so much more than just, churches trading choirs once a year, and, the black pastor comes and preaches in the white church, and the white pastor goes and tries to preach in the black church. And, that's, I think, for so long, we've accepted that as racial reconciliation. And you make the point, and I've heard it from other people too, that there's you talk about it, just the difference between conciliation, reconciliation. Is there even such a thing as reconciliation in the terms in which we use it?
Yeah, I mean, it comes from the sense in which, has there ever been a period of great race relations between Black and white people such that we need to return to that or reconcile, right? And so some people will say, since that period never has existed historically, how can we talk about reconciliation when there's never been conciliation? To which I say, I certainly understand that. And if people want to use that language, I'm not mad about it. I still use reconciliation because that's a Bible word. That is a word that as Christians we can claim, and it has a lot of theological depth and richness to it. I also say, it depends on how far back you go, because when has there ever been conciliation between God and humankind? You got to go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, right? So if God in the Bible is willing to call it reconciliation between God and humanity, then I think in a similar sense, in terms of chronology and theology, we can call it reconciliation between Black people and white people.
And I wanted to ask you, I meant to ask you this a few minutes ago when we were talking about just some of the awareness piece, because I was telling you before we started that something that I have, when I first heard it, probably last year, when I was really diving into this awareness, reading a lot, trying to listen to a lot of people of color. And so there were some thoughts and ideas that I was exposed to that I was not familiar with. And at first was I was actually offended at first, and then when I understood what was being said, I wasn't offended. I was enlightened. There was a knowledge that made sense to me, but I'm not sure I can explain it very well to other people. So maybe somebody who's watching might really benefit from hearing you explain this idea of white. That white is not a race. Am I saying that right? Am I putting it in the right term?
Well,
That
the way I
races,
would
that
put it,
whiteness as a race is like, as a racial construct, is it's kind of a distortion of, you help, see, I can't even say it very well. Help me.
yeah, I mean, this is why there's really work to do to understand race, racism, white supremacy, these concepts and terms that we hear so often. We think we really know what it's about, but when we dig in and realize there's whole fields of study dedicated to these topics. And so number one, it makes sense that we wouldn't know everything. And number two, we also need to dedicate ourselves pretty intentionally to learning more about it. So the way I would distinguish it is a couple of things. Number one, race is a social construct. And so one of the things I talk about in How to Fight Racism is that biologically and theologically, there's no basis for modern day American racial categories. So biologically, 99% of our DNA is similar. The amount of melanin in our skin is biologically and in terms of DNA absolutely negligible, right? So there's no biological base for these racial differences, right? And then theologically, of course, all people being made in the image of God, that all being descended from the same forebears, etc. Theologically, there's no difference, there's no exclusion that can come about because of race. But race is real in the sense that society has been constructed around it, and specifically, society has been constructed around this idea of whiteness. Now, whiteness is not the same as white people.
That's
So
what I didn't understand. And
yeah,
that's initially, and that's where I stumbled at first, because
absolutely.
I couldn't distinguish what was being said. That's why it
Right.
was so helpful to hear that from you.
Yeah. So white people are people of European descent who in the United States, you all get lumped into this category called white, even though you're Swedish, French, British, Irish, whatever it might be, right? But it's people of European descent who in the United States came to be labeled white. Now, whiteness is the ideology wrapped around this racial category that says whiteness, what is white is right. It is central, it is superior, and then by correlation, everything of color, and especially that which is considered Black, is marginal, inferior, exotic, somehow wrong. So when people talk about whiteness, they're talking about the idea and the ideology that bolsters this sort of hierarchy in our society based on color. It's not necessarily talking about people of European descent. It's more so talking about people who hold the idea of whiteness.
Yeah, that's helpful, because I think that people who aren't willing to dig very deep into what is being said, who will just take that on the surface, will take that as offensive and run with it. And that's not even what's being said, but we do have to take the time to really listen to hear what people are saying, to hear explanations, to hear not just what you've always been told, but also what else is being said. Someone, a new friend of mine, I heard her say recently that you talked about telling the truth, and she was talking about telling the truth, that in families, almost everybody's got a weird uncle, or there's somebody that we're just kind of like, yeah, we don't talk about him very much or her very much because for whatever reasons. And so, but you're not telling your whole family story without telling all of that. And so likewise here in the United States, if we don't tell, I'm learning, if we don't really tell our whole story, even the weird uncle, or the bad parts of our story as a nation, or the bad parts of our story as a church, or the bad parts of our story as a denomination. I grew up in the Southern Baptist denomination. I didn't know until 20 years ago. I've been a Southern Baptist my whole life. I didn't really realize that whole denomination was founded on slavery. Those who wanted to continue to be able to have slaves, and those who didn't, and that Baptist denomination split. I didn't know that this denomination that I had been a part of had that as its history and that as its roots. And of course, now that I do, I'm going to talk about that because that's part of the story. And it's a part of the story that I'm not proud of. In fact, I don't particularly associate with that at all because I can't get past the beginnings. But it's telling our whole story and taking the time to listen to what people are saying. I think that's what builds, I hear you saying that's what builds relationships, is when we're really willing to listen to each other.
For sure. To listen to each other, to get out of our echo chambers, right? Like, it's really easy to overlook some of that really tragic racial history when there are no racial or ethnic minorities in your presence who are sort of bringing it up or have attention to it. And so this gets perpetuated generation after generation across denominations and churches. It is the necessity of building in diversity, not just in church. I think that's a misstep that we make as Christians, is thinking that we need to diversify the pews, when the reality is we need to diversify our lives. It's not just what happens on Sunday morning and who's around in the church building. It's about who you're around Monday through Saturday, and how that is affecting you and shaping you.
I just like the way you said that, not diversify our pews, but diversify our lives. I like those little one-liners because they're so easy to hang on to and remember and say, okay, I could do that. That makes sense. There's a paragraph and then there's a phrase, and the phrase makes it so simple and doable. So if a white church or a white listener really wanted to know how they could be an ally in the fight for racial justice, there is this arc, but is there anything that you would add to that? If somebody in particular said, I really want to be an ally, tell me how to get started. What do I do differently than I'm doing now?
Well, if we're talking on a congregational level, your church has to vocally, publicly, and in a sustained way pursue justice. So I say that's important because for me personally, it's not so much about the level of demographic diversity in a congregation. It's about whether my concerns and priorities and the things that affect me and my family are concerns and priorities for the congregation. This is why so many Black people felt alienated when we found that 81% of white evangelical voters who voted for the previous president. It was a sense that, all of our concerns about the rhetoric, the policies, the actions just made no difference, right? And we could have stayed in that predominantly white setting, but it was clear that what concerned us didn't concern the leadership or the rest of the congregation. And so it's that commitment to justice that will tell us differently. And the reality is there might be churches, maybe simply because of where you are located geographically, that will never really be all that racially or ethnically diverse, but you can still pursue justice. And you got to do that vocally, meaning publicly. A lot of folks don't want to do that because it invites controversy, and they're afraid of what people will say, what labels they'll attach to them. But the question isn't that, it's a question of righteousness and justice. And is it a fear of God or a fear of man that is motivating your actions? a commitment to racial justice at the church level. You should have a racial justice statement specifically focused on race, right? Like not just broadly justice. Race is the dividing line, the literal dividing line in our country. It should be part of your new members class. It should be part of that curriculum that says when you sign up for this congregation, you're signing up to be part of racial justice. And if that's not for you, then this church is not for you. It should be obviously the preaching series and everything like that, but it should be so embedded in the curriculum that people are getting it naturally and organically in Sunday school, in Bible studies on Sunday morning, not just the specific sermon series, but it's in different illustrations, different applications, different topics that you address. Churches occasionally will need to make, I think, public statements about issues of justice. If you're a church in Minneapolis and you didn't say something about George Floyd or Derek Chauvin, that is a deafening silence that communicates a whole lot about your congregation. And so I'm not saying every single national event, but probably more than we're used to, we're going to have to actually take a public stance on and speak out for the cause of the dignity of people and the justice that Jesus promotes. So those are a few ways I think churches can begin to tackle the issue of justice, which that I think should be the pursuit, because that's ongoing. And diversity it comes along with that pursuit of justice. But if diversity is the goal, then guess what? You can reach a certain level of diversity, 20%, 50%, whatever it might be. And then you think your work is done. And it's all about, really the pursuit is all about trying to keep these different people together, which most of the time means avoiding the really touchy but important topics for the sake of a form of unity that's not real, true, deep unity at all.
That's a great point. I heard you say it on someone else's interview, and I'm so glad you said it here, which is that if the pursuit is diversity, that we're only going to get so far. We're not going to get to that goal of racial justice. And because you said it, to do that, to keep something diverse, we have to tamp down the conflict so that we don't upset anybody. And so everybody stays in we have an equal number here, equal number there. But if you really want to get to racial justice, you're going to have to go beyond that as the goal. And that's a really good word. And I think that'll be scary to some folks because, first of all, nobody likes conflict. That's and right. Secondly, a lot of us don't
Some
really
people
know.
Online seem to like conflict.
Well, that's a whole other topic. But yes, they do. I feel like they eat, sleep, drink, breathe conflict. But in church, we don't really like it. And so to avoid that, I think we've just tried to keep the awareness down, keep relationships at a surface level, and certainly very little commitment to any kind of actual actionable items toward change. And that will never get us to that racial justice that you've said is really the call from God. And I'm saying, I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of the fight for racial justice. And that's going to mean, a deep awareness that doesn't always make us feel good. Awareness sometimes of sin doesn't make you feel good. Awareness of failure doesn't make you feel good. Awareness of shortcomings, awareness of good heart, but poor action, that doesn't make us feel good, but it gets us to the truth. And then from there, then we're really going to reach out in true kind of friendship, true kind of community, not just because you're different and diverse from me, but because, hey, I like you. I love you. I love you. And that is going to then, to me, it feels like that when you genuinely love people, you want the best for them. You want the best for everybody. And so then you're going to make a commitment to do the hard, doable things, around systems and laws and saying those things out loud.
I think all of this is hard. I think all of this is hard, but it's not complicated. Jesus makes it so simple when asked, what's the greatest commandment? Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so when it comes to racial justice, if you really want to break it down, it is wanting for your neighbor the same thing you want for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not more complicated than that. And if you hear Black people and people of color constantly saying, you know, the police aren't this friendly, benevolent force in our communities, or we don't get callbacks for job interviews because my name might be Lakeisha or Laquan, and that's an automatic, even if involuntary or subconscious response on people. Or if we're saying, you know what, because of deliberate policies, even our homes, they could be the same exact square footage, the same exact model, but because it's in a Black neighborhood, it's going to be valued less than it's in a white neighborhood. And so loving our neighbor simply means I want for my neighbor what I want for myself, and what can I do to get there? All right. So I just, we don't have to overcomplicate it. It's hard enough already. We don't have to overcomplicate it.
Yeah. I can overthink things. But
no, I wasn't saying that.
No, but I know it to be true. Sometimes when I get overwhelmed on something, it's usually because I've overcomplicated it. And so just that great reminder, that is it. It really is. That is all that we are saying for each other is, I want for you what I would want for myself. And that's where I'm thinking back to that movie that I watched. I was sitting there thinking, as a white mother, I could see that happening to my child, and them coming out of that encounter with the police after stealing a cop car being okay. But knowing if I was sitting next to my my friend who has a biracial son, she's not looking at it the same way, and she's in great anxiety because she knows that's not really the reality for her. Well, why would I want that for her? I want for her what I want for myself. I want her to have that same peace of mind, that same knowledge that her child is going to be treated well. Right. And when we come at all of this through that lens, it feels like it does kind of sort through all the noise, all the complication, all the, oh, but this, oh, but that. It's like, just love each other truly from the heart, the way that God has loved us and want for each other. That doesn't feel like all sunshine and butterflies, because love is the hardest thing we do. Love is the hardest work we do. So to reduce it to love is not to reduce it to simple, but it reduces it to uncomplicated. That's right. Because love requires action. Yes. And we got to take action. Yeah. You say, just a couple of things you said that fighting racism is, this quote from your book, fighting racism is not just about changing the world, it's about changing you. Like that. And you said, today is the day, and now is the time to join this journey toward racial justice. So as we close out here, would you just, what is your hope in the midst of all that you've been seeing, the conversations you've been having across America with all different sorts of people? What is your hope? Do you have hope? First of all, do you have hope? And if you do, kind of what is it? And if you would share it with us. So to the first and really crucial part of that question, do I have hope? Yes, I have hope, because to be a Christian is to have hope. The hope that out of the horrendous murder of a man named Jesus Christ, the God-man, that there comes resurrection and redemption. And the hope that because of that, we can have reconciliation with God and other people in this life. And the hope that in eternal life we'll dwell with the triune God forever, right? So to call yourself a Christian is to call yourself a person of hope. The two are inseparable. That being said, hope is not pie in the sky dreaming or pining. It is taking a realistic assessment of the circumstances, but having the faith that things can be different. So I am as real as I can be about where we are racially speaking. And the sad fact is, we are still fighting for voting rights in 2021, which is the same fight we had in 1961 or 1861, right? The realistic assessment is that
all the way back in the 1960s, the Black Panther Party was formed, and its full name was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Self-defense against whom? Police in Black communities. And still we're fighting anti-Black police brutality. So that's the realistic assessment, but I do have faith that things can be different. And whenever oppressive forces have arisen against the church or in society, there's always a faithful remnant of people that pushes back and resists. So to me, the signs of hope come in the fact that people will not simply lie down and take injustice. We're going to speak out and speak up and take action. And it might always be a minority in terms of quantity, but we are powerful. Faith like a mustard seed can move a mountain, right? And so that faith through Jesus, that things can be different tomorrow, can move a country, can move a nation in this journey toward racial justice. Sometimes I need help having hope, and I get that from other people, and I get that from community, and I get that from looking at the micro and not just the macro. And the small group at a church that's taking this on, the revelation or epiphany or realization you had watching a movie, the people who pick up these books to read and commit to doing things different. There's signs of hope all over the place if we know what to look for and where to look. So yes, I have hope, but it's a lifelong journey and struggle that we labor for a day we may not see. We labor to leave a legacy, and we labor for the sake of the next generation, who hopefully will not have to contend with the same issues of racism that we did.
I feel like when things began changing for us at our church last year with the awareness piece that began, and our intentionality of hearing the stories of, first of all, with our Black and people of color, their stories, and then our intentions to make our church really a multi-ethnic church that celebrates and fully incorporates every ethnicity, every culture. So I feel like God kind of gave me this vision then of this three-legged race of the country fair. It's, the Olympics are coming up in July in Tokyo, and Summer Olympics, there's going to be runners, there's track and field, and the stuff of track and field, it's gorgeous. There's athletes in their prime, and they run, and it just blows my mind. It's a thing of beauty to watch. But a three-legged race like at a country fair is nothing like that. It's clumsy, overweight, middle-aged people trying to get to the finish line. It's putting your arm around somebody, both of you sticking a leg in a gunny sack, and then stumbling your way toward the finish line, and inevitably you fall flat, you do face plant. Yeah. Somebody's running faster, and you fall down, and you only win if you actually, you can't separate out of that three-legged race and one of you going up to the finish line. You have to go up there together. And I feel like the Lord kind of gave me this vision of that's what we're doing as we're running in this race toward racial injustice. It's not the Olympics. It's not a thing of beauty. It's not a thing of sleek, smooth, precision. Man, it's just sharp. No, it's a couple of dumpy people with their arms around each other, leg in a bag, stumbling forward. Black and white together, people of color, and we don't win. The prize is that racial justice of being a church that looks like heaven. Well, we don't win that by ourselves. So it's not like I could run to the finish line by myself. I only win if I get there with you. You only win if you get there with me. And so it's, to me, what God said was, it may be messy. There's going to be some face plants. It's going to be ugly. It's not a thing of beauty, but it's possible. You just have to you fall, you get up, you put your arm back around each other. Both of you put a leg back in their bag, and you stumble toward that finish line together. And that's what I hear you saying, even as you talk about hope. It's a qualified hope. You have hope because of Jesus Christ and what he's done for us. This idea of racial justice is, man, it's hard work. It's messy. We're going to do face plants. We already do. But that we really can get there together. And I think that that's the commitment that I'm making with my life, is that I'm in it, I'm in it, but I'm in it only with my arm linked, with my brothers and sisters. I can't get there by myself. I can't get there by myself. I don't want to get there by myself. It wouldn't be, it'd be a very hollow victory. I only want to get there if I'm connected with my brothers and sisters. So thank you, Jemar. Thank you for writing these books. Thank you for letting God use you, your story. Thank you for putting in the work day in, day out, the fatigue of doing interviews and telling the story over and over and over again. I appreciate it. I thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And I join you in that deep hope that you have, that we will get there. We will get there together.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, inviting me on your platform to share with the people who know and follow and appreciate you. So I cherish these conversations and pray that it can move us forward in this journey toward racial justice.
Amen.
Thanks.
Amen. Thank you so much.